All right, you guys, I'm going to work through the histology of the bone tissue just for a few minutes and then try to upload this and see how this goes because Camtasia is not my recording of choice. Doceri is, and I'm not set up to record that right now, so we're going to see how this does. And so I'll end up having two videos for you. All right, so here's what we're going to do. The last thing that we took a look at was going to be just the bone cells and then the extracellular fluid, also known as the matrix, that's outside of the bone, which includes the organic portion, mostly collagen. Remember, collagen is a protein, and the inorganic portion, mainly calcium phosphate. All right, from here we're going to get into the histology of the bone, and we're going to be looking at the histology of compact bone. So remember, there are two types of bone, and your two types of bone are compact bone and spongy bone. And when you take a look at compact bone, remember histology, we're talking about the study of tissues, and we're looking at the tissue underneath the microscope. And so what we're going to see underneath the microscope are going to be the osteons, and the osteons are the structural unit of the bone. Now remember, this is compact bone. So we're going to take a look at the osteons being the structural unit of the compact bone. The osteons have an AKA of being known as the Haversian system, and so there are several different parts and players to this osteon that we're going to be taking a look at. So what I want you to see is this part of the bone. So this could potentially be in the diaphysis somewhere. So this is going to be the periosteum around the outside, which you know has two layers. It has the fibrogenic layer and it has the osteogenic layer. And the periosteum is dense, irregular connective tissue proper that's wrapping around the outside of our bone tissue. And then this part is actually bone, being compact bone. And we would go through compact bone before we would get into the spongy bone if we were down at the proximal end. Or this could simply be medullary cavity if we were kind of right in the middle of the diaphysis of the long bone. So that's what you're looking at. And then the other thing that you see in this compact bone is we actually see these tunnels or these tubes that are going through here. So let's do this in a different color. So these are the tunnels or the tubes that are running through bone. And so when we think about bone, we think about bone being solid structures, but remember that they're not, and remember that you've got blood vessels that are coming into the bone from the outside, which makes sense to us, and if you remember that they come in through nutrient foramina, and we have to get blood vessels into the deep inside part of the bone, because in here in the deep inside part is where you have the red bone marrow, and remember that the red bone marrow is making the blood cell. So if this is going to be our red blood cell, the red blood cell has to be able to actually get into the blood vessel, and then we would take the red blood cell out of the bone, and it will travel through the rest of the body. So in doing this, what we see then, and I'll go back to yellow as a highlight, is we see blood vessels coming in and going deep into the bone, and then we see the vessels would travel in this tube, which would go this way, and then they would go deeper in, and then they would travel in this tube, and then they would go deeper in this way, and then eventually get into the marrow. So these are basically like little tunnels or tubes that the vessels can take. And remember, where it looks like it doesn't connect here, remember that this is 3D. So we may not hit it at a transverse cut, but this tunnel may be going down and then coming out somewhere out here. So when you see all of that, all right, from our original picture here, what we're talking about when we're dealing with the osteon or the Haversian system is we're talking about in the histology of the tissue, this entire system that's got several different major players. And this is what you were used to seeing in chapter, well, I don't know what chapter, but when we were looking at histology and bone tissue, and what we would say is, oh yeah, they look like tree trunks, that's bone tissue, okay, now we're done. What I want you to know is what you were looking at that looked like a tree trunk is called the osteon, or the Haversian system, and this is going to be a component of several different pieces. This osteon, being the structural unit of the cell, is going to or the structural unit of the bone, is going to contain all the things that we need to make bone tissue function. So if you take a look at this, then what I want you to see is what you could see underneath the microscope is in this drawing right here. This is an osteon, and here's another osteon, and here's another osteon, and here's an osteon that's been cut in half that you can see the entire length of. And here's another osteon, and they've actually just telescoped out parts of the osteon so you could see what was going on in there. And there's another one. So in essence, if we're talking about a bone, your typical dog bone, what we would see is an osteon here, and the osteon is going to run down the length of the bone, kind of like a column. And so I'm going to draw one in the diaphysis here. That's one osteon, so it's going to look like this, and it's going to run down in this direction. And then in that one osteon, there's going to be a hole in the center of that thing, and that center is going to be called the central canal. We're going to see this on the next slide. And then around that hole is going to be what looks like the rings of a target. And that's what you ended up seeing over here underneath the microscope. So we didn't even know what we were looking at, but now we know that this is an osteon, the structural unit of the bone. And in the center of the osteon, there's going to be a central canal. And then around the central canal are going to be rings of bone tissue, which remember is calcified or hardened matrix. That's going to be like this. So in the center, where we have the central canal, it's a great name for it, what you're going to find in the center is going to be blood vessels and nerves. That's good enough for us right now. Blood vessels and nerve fibers. So arteries, veins, and nerves. So when you look at the center of this particular osteon, so I'm going to go back over here to the picture of the bone. When you look at the center of this osteon, you can see the central canal, and in that central canal there are red, blue, and yellow, which indicate arteries, veins, and nerves. And again, here's an even better picture. Here's an osteon that's been telescoped out for us, and we see arteries, veins, and nerves. So that's how we can tell that bones are highly vascularized and bones have a lot of nerve supply, because in those long canals that run down the length of the bone, the central canals of the osteon, that's where you've got blood vessels and nerves running. Now, these rings of bone tissue are going to be called lamella. And the lamella are the actual rings. So what we're seeing here is this is a lamella from here to here, and it would be this entire ring. So that ring of bone is called a lamella. And then the next ring of bone is going to be a larger lamella, because we're making these like circumferential rings. And then the next larger ring of bone is going to be another lamella. Okay, so that's what we're seeing in those, in the picture of the osteon. So this would be lamella 1, lamella 2, lamella 3, and then it looks like it runs into another lamella. Now, lamella is the ring of calcified matrix or bone tissue that you're seeing within each one of those osteons. So the other thing that you can do is take a look at the osteon, and what you will notice is in the spaces between those lamella, you are going to see these darkened areas like this. And then here's another one, and another one, and another one. So if I were to draw this out, and we're going to see a much larger picture, and this is going to make way more sense. But there's your central canal, and then there's your first ring or your first lamella, and here's your second lamella, and then here's your third lamella. Then all of this is bone tissue. It's calcified matrix, so it's what we know as the hard bone. And then from lamella to lamella, you're going to see these dark areas. Well, in those dark areas, the dark areas are hollowed out cavities called lacuna. And in lacuna, we were calling these the cocoons in class, or the hollowed out areas or cavity. That's where the osteocyte sits. And the osteocyte, if you remember the pictures of it, almost look like an eye with these really long eyelashes, the osteocyte. So an osteocyte would be in between these two lamella, and its really long eyelashes would go this way. And the next osteocyte would be here with the really long eyelashes going this way. And then they would actually be connecting. And then there's one out here with the really long eyelashes this way. So the dark area is the hole or the lacuna that is filled with the osteocyte. So this is the cell, and you'd have to go back to the picture and look at the picture of the osteocyte. There he is, that looks like that. And then what you have to remember is these cells are alive, and in order for them to stay alive, they have to get nutrients and oxygen from the arteries or the blood vessels and that are in the center of the central canal. So if this blood vessel is carrying nutrient or oxygen, it would go through some smaller canals we're going to name in just a second. And these smaller canals are going to pierce the bony matrix so that the nutrients can get to this cell. And then the nutrients would go through another canal to get through this cell. And then the nutrients would go through another canal to get to this cell. And remember, these cells are communicating with each other through gap junctions. So if we're bringing a nutrient out and it goes from one cell, it can just move, the nutrient can move from one cell to the other. And that includes oxygen. And then we got to go back this direction too to get rid of waste products and carbon dioxide. So that's all part of the system, if that makes sense. We only have two more players to deal with as we look at this. So let's move forward. The osteon itself, so we do have the lamella, and the lamella is the columns of matrix. Remember, the matrix is mostly collagen that has been calcified because there's the inorganic matrix, and these columns are weight-bearing. So this is what allows us to put pressure down on the bone. And so if you think about the columns going down this way and then the pressure. The lamella are concentric. And what that means is they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger from the central canal, and they're circumferential, which means they go completely around. And interstitial means we're talking about the lamella is what's found between the cells. So remember, we use the term interstitial fluid, and that's the fluid found between the cells. So the lamella is the matrix that's in between the cells. So that's by definition what your lamella is. And then you have the central canal. And the central canal is what has, which is the hole in the center of the osteon that contains the blood vessels and nerves, and it's running down the length of the bone. And then you have what are called the perforating or Volkmann's canals. And we did not mention Volkmann's canal, but I'm going to take you back to the previous slide to show you what that is. So any osteon that is here is going to have the central canal that's going to run in this direction, which makes me think of the length of the bone. Any canal that goes perpendicular to the central canal is going to be called Volkmann's canal or perforating canal, because it's like it's perforating the bone. It's going deep into the bone. And so basically what's happening is this. If we think about how we want to get a blood vessel deep inside the bone, we would come through the nutrient foramen of the periosteum, and we would go deep through a Volkmann canal, and then we would travel along a central canal, and then we would go deeper through a Volkmann's canal, and then we would travel along a central canal, and then we would go deeper through a Volkmann's canal. So you only have two options when you're giving somebody directions from the outside of the bone to get deep into the bone. You can go Volkmann, central, Volkmann, central, and Volkmann. So if you're running along the axis of the bone, that's going to be a central canal in the center of an osteon. If you go at a right angle and you go deeper into the bone, then you're on a Volkmann's canal or in a Volkmann's canal. So Volkmann's canal, channels that connect blood and nerves from the periosteum, so remember this is outside, into the central canal of the osteon. So you would have an osteon here, and an osteon here, and an osteon here. And that blood vessel could go central canal, Volkmann canal, central canal, Volkmann canal, central canal, Volkmann canal, and then get into the spongy bone. All right, so when we take a look at this up close, this is going to make a lot more sense now. So this is a wedge or a piece of pie of your osteon. So this is your central canal. And in the central canal, you have nerves, and you have veins, and you have arteries. And then around the central canal, here's lamella number 1, lamella number 2, lamella number 3, lamella number 4, etc. So those are circumferential and concentric circles. And then in between the lamella, you can see the lacuna where the osteocytes live. So here's the lacuna. That's the darkened area with the osteocytes. And then one last thing that we need to add is going to be this word called canaliculus, or canaliculi is plural. And these are interconnecting canals. And these are the canals that are actually going to penetrate through the lamella to get from one osteocyte to the next. And this is where the osteocytes can connect by gap junctions. There's a good example. So when you look at a lacuna, which is a pocket or a cavity, and then in that you put an osteocyte, and an osteocyte looks like this, and the osteocyte has these extensions coming off of it. So we know that osteocyte looks like this. It looks like a big eyeball. And then if we put another lacuna here with another osteocyte in it, and the extensions off the osteocyte go like this, these osteocytes can communicate with each other by gap junctions. So here are the gap junctions. And then these extensions off of the osteocytes are running through little canals called canaliculus or canaliculi. So if you think about if you wanted to get some oxygen from here, the oxygen would go through a canaliculus, through the lamella, and get to this cell. And then oxygen could diffuse through a canaliculus, through the lamella, to get to this cell. And then it could diffuse through the canaliculus to get through the lamella to get to this cell. Now, when you take a look at this and what you're used to seeing underneath the microscope now, so this whole thing is the osteon. Here is your central canal with your blood vessels and your nerves in here. And then these, every time you see these little rings are going to be your lamella. And then these dark spots, like here, that's the lacuna that contains the osteocyte. And if you look at them, they look like little eyes with false eyelashes. And so it's going to be the real dark lacuna with the osteocyte in it, coming off like this. And then these projections off of the osteocyte are running through what's going to be called the canaliculus. Okay, so that's a smaller picture of it. And then on a bigger scale, when you go back here and look now, this is where you can see the entire osteon and then how they are interconnected with the Volkmann's canals. All right, let's see how this does.